Okay, the fourth episode on the ancestors. And this time I want to talk about the otherworldly inheritance. Spirits can pass down through the generations, so we're told. I've got no direct experience of this myself. And there's also the fairies, or what we call the fairies in England. They're called pixies or piskies down in Cornwall. They're the little people, or the leprechauns in Ireland. There's all sorts of names for them. And you get them all over the world. So we're plugging into something universal here. And they are also something we need to bear in mind. And we don't at our peril, because they are tricksy. And are they real or not even? Well, if you try and pin them down too much, they disappear. Did I just see something or didn't I? And that's the nature of the other world, generally. It can't be pinned down in the way that we like to pin things down as humans in this world. It'll switch in the other direction or it disappears. My mother grew up in the west of Ireland on a farm, and she used to wander off on her own. She seemed to spend her whole life wandering off on her own. And she used to wander down to the local woods, and she told me more than once that she used to hang out there with the little people. And she gave me a detailed description of them, their names, what they looked like, the colour of their clothes, how ancient they looked. She gave me this detailed description once, and then the next time I asked her about it, just to sort of firm it up a bit, so to speak, she goes, "Did I say that?" You know, there was I trying to pin it down, and she denied it. And maybe she got it out of a book. Who knows? But there was that kind of connection in her. And funny thing, my name. Maybe I'll just regale you with stories. My name, Barry. Yeah. I mean, that was my dad's idea. And he was English and straight and called the shots. My mother, who was a bit younger than him, respectably younger for those days, um, she wasn't straight at all. She was anything but straight. And she didn't call the shots. She went along. So my dad decided before I was born I was going to be Barry. So she went along with it. And then I looked up the meaning of my name, and there's a fairy mound. You get fairy mounds. And there was one in Knockmar in Ireland, near Toome, about an hour from where my mother grew up, as it happens. And the king of the fairies there was called Fionbar, Bharr. And that is one name from which Barry is derived. Not the only explanation, but that is one. It's like the king of the fairies. At a Hang on a minute. Someone just WhatsApped me. And they're still WhatsApping me right in the middle of this. That's the fairy interference. It knocks me off my concentration. So where was I? That's why I paused. That's my name, from the king of the fairies, from where my mum, who used to hang out with the fairies, grew up. And that wouldn't have been my father's intention at all. He didn't believe in such nonsense. And 42 years later, not having looked up this story, which of course is completely true and absolutely real, I called my son Finn, which is the other half of Fionbar. And when he was tiny as a baby, there was like this tinkling laughter used to come from him, like from the fairy realm. But it wasn't until he was probably about 15 or something that I looked this up, and I found, he's the other half of that name. And so the fairy lineage continues unbeknownst. And it's a very fairy-like way in which it happened. I want to put the fairies in the south of the medicine wheel, the water place, because that's the place of the trickster. And that's often how they work. They operate round the sides and they come in their own way. And it's sometimes ouchy, but we learn something. They will help us. But you've got to leave them offerings. You've got to honour them and talk to them and leave leave bits of land aside for them. It belongs to them. In the year 2000, I ended up buying a 12-acre field near Glastonbury where I was living. And it was known locally as the last refuge of the fairies. Fenny Castle, it was called. You can visit it. And it's half hill, 6 acres a hill, and 6 acres roughly a flat. And I felt like it was fine to use the flat, but the hill didn't feel like human territory. I mean, it didn't stop me going up there in hopefully a respectful kind of way, but often I wouldn't want to, certainly not at night. It just didn't feel like I belonged there. It's like some other presence was there. And that was the fairy thought, and it looks after itself. When I first got the field, I used to feel, walking around it, I could feel like these big beings, bigger than me, behind me, following me round. And it was as if they were checking me out. This guy, getting to know me. This guy, it was by their graces that I got the field. It's almost like it fell into my hands. It just had that feeling I was meant to have it. So I went, oh, okay, it's not necessarily what I would have chosen, but I've been chosen for it. And so I'll put that first. And I was happy to have it. It was taken over by horses in the end while I owned it. And the camps I had there just sort of fell apart. And I'm sure that was what the fairies wanted. I wanted somewhere for camps, but they had other ideas. And it wasn't maybe a bad idea because I did need to stop teaching. I was in my mid-40s and I didn't sufficiently know what I was talking about. I needed to wait until my early 60s before I sufficiently knew what I was talking about because there's no hurry. You can do a lot of good in a short time. So you could say they helped me to do that. But it's taken me a long perspective to see how that was a help. And we once had a camp there, and we had a kitchen tent, and there was a sort of gale in the night, but it only really affected the kitchen tent. The wind came and picked it up and blew everything over on the table or off the table, except one thing that was left standing, which was a bottle of vinegar. Now, fairies don't like vinegar, so the story goes, and that was what was left standing. So it's like, okay, we took the vinegar out the field. So that was how they made it clear that they didn't want vinegar and that they corresponded to traditional fairy law. And you also get plats. You get fairy plats in the manes of horses, and we had horses out there, and they were always getting plats in them. And the person who owned them was convinced that it was people. And then we moved down to Devon, which is also a fairy place, and the plats continued. And she was still convinced it was people. But they'd have had to drive a mile out into the countryside and walk up a lane where there was no parking in the middle of the night so they wouldn't be seen, tie a quick plat and come back, if the horses would let them. So it wasn't, you know. And of course, are they plats or are they tangles? Yeah, that's another thing, the fairy thing. You can't be absolutely certain. And that's bound to be like that. And fairies are very good for us like that. You know, they remind us to just be fluid in who we are and don't set things in stone and allow for the unexpected and don't plan too much. All of those things. And remember that this is other subtler realm beside us that dances lightly, it's full of joy and it's spontaneous and playful, which we humans forget. So we can learn so much from the fairies. But we mustn't reveal too much. There's a book came out in the 17th century by a guy called the Reverend Robert Kirk. He was a vicar at a place called Aberfoyle it's in Scotland. I actually went there in April of this year. So yeah, he wrote this book called The Secret Commonwealth, all about fairies and goblins and all the rest of it. And above his parish, there's this hill, and it's got a tree in it, an old pine tree. And he used to walk up there regularly, and it's a fairy mound. And one day, he didn't return. This is about a year after he published his book. And they eventually found what was meant to be his body and buried him. But what had actually happened is that the fairies were angry with him for revealing all their secrets in this book. And so they imprisoned him in the tree. And they put a doppelganger, a replica of his body, out on the ground to be found. And that's what they buried. But really, he's up in the tree, imprisoned there for revealing their secrets. And it is a bit like that. And I hope I haven't said too much here. I don't think I have. I don't feel I have. And what's that about, revealing their secrets? Well, for me, it relates to being discreet about your kind of otherworldly or your deeper experiences or your powerful dreams. All of those need to be kept quiet about. You don't talk about them, not too readily. You talk about them to select people. But they're not for the world. They're not for broadcasting. You try and make a name for yourself as a fairy person who teaches fairy lore and all the rest of it. All sorts of strange things are going to happen around you. They don't want to be public like that. They just want to be left alone in their places. So can we see fairies? Well, it depends on how you see. I feel things, and it's a heart thing. Yeah, there's a heart connection for me with fairies. Some people see things. Yeah, and it's like, did I see something or didn't I? But you feel a presence. I've got a fairy tree in my garden. I planted it there in November 23. And 5 minutes down the road from me, through a field and over a gate, there's a little stream and a bridge and there's a tree. And that's quite a special place. That is a fairy place. Can't prove it. That's how it feels to me. And when I planted the tree in my garden, the Japanese snowbell, it's called. They grow to about 30 foot. This one's about 8 foot. It's quite big already when I got it. And they're covered in little white flowers in the summer. And it felt that when I planted it, the fairies from down there came up here. It's not like they're no longer at the other place. It doesn't work like that. They're also here, but they came from there. Because fairies in one place, you can talk to fairies in one place, and you're talking to fairies all over the place. They don't have the boundaries of time and space that we do. They live in a more fluid world. And there's probably half a dozen places at least that I go to on Dartmoor that I think of or feel about. I feel about in that sort of way. And I'll stop and talk. And it's good to stop and talk to them and remember them and leave something for them. Leave some silver or a bit of wine or a bit of food, something like that. And you can tell them about everything. Yeah? And you can thank them because they will take care of us. I've told them I will do their work. And I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to be of service. I'm happy to have my whole life under their direction. And you just sort of, it's something you feel. You feel this is the thing to do now. This is what they want me to do. You can't prove it, but you kind of feel it. And it's the same with your spirits around you. Feel them with you. Call them to mind. Just get used to having that sense of something other around you that's precious, that's guiding, that's rich, that's nourishing, that helps you. All those things. There's a book called Daemonic Reality by Patrick Harpur, Harpur. I'd recommend that. It's subtitled A Field Guide to the Other World. He hasn't been imprisoned in a tree yet for doing that, as far as I'm aware. So clearly he didn't give too much away. Um, yeah, he writes all about these beings from all over the world, but he includes everything that's kind of, is it there or isn't there? Aliens, that's another one. They're the latest incarnation of that realm. And people will see them collectively. They're not just kind of made up. They're not a sort of mental health issue. Um, there was some kind of spaceship over Norfolk in the 70s at some point that a number of different people saw. They belong, Jung called them from the collective unconscious, but they're not, but they're real. They're only not conscious from our point of view, but they're very conscious and very real. That was his language, but it's kind of collective. They're in, they're part of the universe as one big connected being. So yes, I'd recommend Patrick Harper's book, Daimonic Reality, Daimonic. And what he's very good at is exploring this type of reality and getting us not to take things literally. I mean, you might have noticed that's been a constant theme of mine throughout these videos, is not to take things literally. Take them seriously, but be fluid around them. Be prepared to change how you see things. So I'd recommend that book, both, from the point of view of info, but also in terms of understanding and approach to this reality. And these ancestors, because they've always been there. A friend of mine has a website called the Fairy Whisperer, and she regularly does podcasts, interviews people about fairies. And something she was saying was that, well, the fairies live a lot longer than us. So whatever work we do for them, that will be continuing after we're dead. That, in a way, is our legacy. I thought that's a good way of looking at it. We might die, but that work we've been doing, that continues. So they are part of our inheritance, our ancestral inheritance. Um, find places that speak to you in nature, special places, often a bit secluded, as the fairies don't like to be too public. Dartmoor, well, there's Wistman's Wood, that's well known, but the better of it is the far end of it, because less people are there, and in a way the presence is stronger. It's a stunted oak wood, and there's also Blackator Copse, another stunted oak wood, and in a way it's stronger and clearer, the feel there, because people don't go to that nearly so much. Piles Copse too, that's the other stunted oak wood on Dartmoor. Trees are a bit taller there, but there's all this kind of lichen and moss hanging down from it. It's a powerful presence there. So have some of these places you go to, build a relationship with them, talk to them appreciatively. Give thanks to the fairies there for everything that works in your life. And you can ask for things as well, and they will help. You ask from a heartfelt place. That's what the fairies understand. Not from our head, but from our hearts. Something that really matters to you, something you're really grateful for, but also things that you need help with. And if you ask in that kind of way, they will help. But never in the way you expect. And there may well be something, as I said earlier on, something a bit ouchy there. You may, for the purpose of you learning something. Yeah. So they're on our side in that kind of way. Fairies are not good and they're not bad. In ordinary human terms, good and evil are human terms. And they're not necessarily these tiny little things either. Like I said, talking about my field, Fenny Castle, it's these big mothers following me around, yeah? And I have a theory that it was Christianity that reduced them to like a few inches high as a way of disempowering them. But don't underestimate them. They are powerful and they live alongside us. The world is full of beings that are not us. There's elementals. I don't know if I've experienced elementals or not. Maybe it's a matter of how you frame it. But there's certain rocks on Dartmoor. I like to hang out with them, almost because of their massiveness. And they feel alive. There's something in them. And I will talk to them in the same way that I'll talk to the fairies. So maybe someone else would say that I'm talking to an elemental when I talk to those rocks. It's worth getting a few books about traditional stories of fairy encounters. There's one called Meeting the Other Crowd by Eddie Lenihan. Fairly recent book. He's not just retelling traditional stories. He actually went and talked to people in a particular area, I think in the southwest of Ireland, local people, stories that up till then had been purely oral. So that was an original thing to do and authentic in a way. They're real fairy stories. People do have these encounters. You get fairy abductions. I have that theory about my mother. In some ways, she never quite knew who she was. She spent the last part of her life kind of wandering, never fitting in anywhere. And she hung out with the fairies. Maybe they claimed her in some strange way. As I said, they are tricksy and they're not necessarily good in our terms. It doesn't make them bad either, but maybe they'll do something like that. I mean, they will do stuff to people. Mm. But also some of the more, you know, stories that have been written down quite a lot as well. They're some of them are well worth reading. You get the Selkies in Scotland. There's a story I told the local storytelling group about a seal killer who eventually became a reformed seal killer. He used to kill seals for a living. He had a special knife and a special whistle that would call them in. And one day he tried to kill this giant seal and it escaped. And that night, a stranger on a horse arrived at his door and ordered him to come with him. They went on a long journey and eventually to a cliff edge and got hold of him, threw them. They both went together into the sea, dived down, deep down, ended up in this like cavern. You like a fairy cavern, a selkie. They're like the seal form. Yeah. Seals that can also become human. They are like Scottish fairies. And he tried to kill the Queen of the Selkies. And he had to cure her by removing the knife. And then he was given enough gold to survive the rest of his days, but he must never kill seals again. And he agreed to do that. And there's a particular bay up there that I went to visit, Duncansby Stacks, where on a full moon, he goes down there, down the cliffs. It's a bit of a scramble. And on the beach, this giant seal turns up, takes off its skin, and the Queen of the Selkies is there. And they dance under the full moon for that night. Because there was something between them. When he took the knife out, their eyes caught each other. So there's lots of stories like that. If you do get given fairy gold, get it to the bank quickly, because it will dissolve into nothing. You need to make it the bank's problem, not yours. Okay, I think maybe I'll leave it there.